Thanks for joining us. We are extremely fortunate to have Professor I. Glenn Cohen here with us today for this special Q&A session as part of this AI Citizenship for Clinicians series. Professor Cohen is one of the world's leading experts on the intersection of bioethics, also known as medical ethics, and the law, as well as on health and technology law. He has advised the U.S. Vice President, he has discussed medical AI policy with members of the U.S. and Korean Congresses, and he has presented to legal, industry, and medical audiences around the world. He is a prolific author and editor with more than 200 publications and 20 books, as well as op-eds in newspapers such as the New York Times. He's here with us today to discuss some of his work on medical AI from a legal and ethics perspective, as well as to answer some of our questions as clinicians preparing to navigate the increased integration of AI into clinical practice. Joy is going to kick us off with the first question.
Thank you very much for taking the time to speak with us today, Professor Cohen. You have written previously about the challenges that AI poses for informed consent. What issues does AI create regarding informed consent? When should clinicians discuss the inclusion of AI in their clinical decision-making with their patients?
So let me take this in two different directions. The first direction is just to say, when we collect data that's used to train artificial intelligence, in particular machine learning, what obligations do we have to tell patients that their data may be used in this way? Is it something patients expect? So there's a whole question about privacy, opt-in, that kind of consent. But I think your question is more about the clinical informed consent. And here again, I want to just take it in slightly two different directions. One is a question of what does the law require you to do? And then the other is what would be best practices or what would be ethically best, and they're a little bit different. When it comes to what the law requires you to do so, in many states, actually, artificial intelligence might be relevant in a surgery case, for example, but not an average clinical decision for a patient. So an example I use is there's somebody who has an enlarged prostate. You're trying to determine whether to do a prostatectomy or to do watchful waiting. What's your obligation to tell a patient that part of what your decision making on that question is influenced, or in some ways influenced a lot, by an AI analysis of what the patient is kind of doing, what their labs say, what their EHR, how they compare it to other patients. And so here, I think it's useful to kind of think about all the things we don't tell patients about our decision making, but when we do tell patients, when we make that exception, I think there's an obligation. So on the one hand, I like this spectrum, but okay, here's two cases that people have strong reactions to. One is, imagine instead of you scrubbing into my surgery, somebody else scrubs into my surgery and performs the surgery. We've got case law making it very clear that there's a legal obligation to get informed consent before that happens. And typically in legal speak, we talk about materiality. What is material to a patient? What matters, to use a lay term, to the patient? That's one way of thinking about it. Some jurisdictions say instead, what would a physician typically disclose as to this? And in both instances, when it comes to someone else scrubbing in for a surgery, you tell the patient. On the flip side, when you've made a decision that's on the basis of a million different things, so the last 7 patients you saw and how this advice worked out for them, vague memory of a medical school lecture, a back issue of JAMA you sort of half read, typically all of those parts about this black box over here, that's not the kind of things that we disclose to a patient. Those are elements of our decision making. So one way of thinking about the issue is the involvement of artificial intelligence more like the substitute surgeon, more like someone else involved in the patient's care, or is it more like that there's a lot of different input of decision making, but this is one of them? So one way of thinking about the problem is that maybe we should be sensitive to how important the AI component is in making the decision. The more the AI is acting autonomously, or the less we understand about the decisions it's making, or the more reliance we're putting on it, the stronger the obligations, at least ethically, if not legally, to disclose to the patient. The more confidence we have in the AI because it has gone through some kind of approval process we might talk about at another juncture, or because we ourselves understand how it is coming to a conclusion the way we would, let's say, an APGAR score, a very simple kind of algorithm, maybe the less obligation we have to disclose to the patient. But these things will change over time as physicians start to disclose more or less sort of standards and practices and norms get established. And that's also an important input. But I often tell people, if you're not going to tell a patient something that seems salient to you, Why aren't you telling the patient? And it's really important, I think, to understand and think that through. If the reason you're not telling the patient is because you think the patient's going to be scared and maybe might make the wrong decision, that's a little bit of an alarm bell, because the whole reason why we have informed consent is in part to improve the autonomy of our patients and to really enable them to make good decision making, because the goal is some kind of shared decision making.
More broadly, how do you believe AI will impact the clinician-patient relationship?
So I think that this is a heterogeneous field. I'm going to say this now. I'm a law professor. I'm like, give me a problem and I'll make it even more complicated for you. But here goes, right? Which is to say, I think there are some forms of AI that are clearly beneficial for physician-patient relationship. And I'll give an example of kind of ambient listening and scribing, right? So I know many physicians, the idea of trying to keep notes of what the patient's telling you at a terminal while talking to somebody about something very serious and very impactful for them, and this idea of like maintaining the kind of trust, confidence, positive affect for them while also trying to take a lot of very detailed notes, quite difficult, as is the experience after your shift is over, writing up your notes in a way. And the fact that we face so much physician and nurse burnout, I think the idea of relieving the scribing duty from a physician is like a wonderful thing that to me really has a strong potential for improving both the life of physicians, their level of satisfaction with their jobs, but also their ability to directly connect with patients. Of course, there's questions about accuracy, there's questions about language, there's questions about accents, for example. But these are kind of, I think, mainstream problems. Overall, the goal seems good. Then there are, though, it seems to me, other kinds of technologies that are a little bit distancing. And my friend who's an ethicist, Bob Trug, wrote this wonderful essay years ago that stuck with me. I'm not a clinician, I'm a lawyer and an ethicist. But he gives the example of the stethoscope. And he says, why do we have stethoscopes? And many people, I think I thought this, believe that the main reason to have a stethoscope or the history of the stethoscope was to improve our ability to hear. But one of the things he points out is historically, it came into practice at a period when putting your head as a male physician, because it really was male physicians then, against the chest of a female patient was suddenly a very stigmatic, very strange thing to do. So we created this technology between the physician and the patient as a way of kind of managing the social moment and the social mores at the time. And I do think this idea, and he uses this phrase, like listening at a distance, the idea that some of what AI ends up doing is creating a sort of distance between the patient and the physician. Because when a patient is trying to make, especially a very critical decision, and asks the physician to say, I really need you to help guide me in what might be one of the biggest decisions of my life, right? One thing the patient can now get without AI, for the most part, is they can get honest, candid, sincere answers from the physician. Now, physicians might not always be great at their metacognition. They may not always know the reasons why they're recommending something, but they can at least kind of be honest about what the sources are and what's leading them to that decision as much as they can achieve it. When it comes to some forms of artificial intelligence, the same is not true, especially more non-interpretable, more opaque forms. The physician themselves has a certain distance between the reasoning process. And I think there's a real way in which the physician may risk becoming a kind of middleman or middlewoman, a middle person between an AI system and a patient, rather than the person that looks the patient in the eye and says, I'm the one who has responsibility for your care, and the buck stops with me. So I think that's important. Now, that is why I'm again, as I told you, I'm nuanced, I'm complex. And just to say, while I think something is lost with AI, there's also a lot of possibility for gain in improving this relationship. One thing is that there is the possibility that the physician can show a patient, well, if I alter this, or if we think you might have been pregnant 1 week less or 1 week longer, or I have this uncertainty, here's how the model might generate a different outcome and a different recommendation. So some idea of co-piloting an AI together, I think is an interesting possibility that might actually empower patients and bring them on the inside. Also, the sense of while physicians bring their whole selves to the table, I often tell people when I give presentations on AI, I say, the end of my presentation, you'll come to the conclusion that AI makes mistakes, that AI often disclaims responsibility, and AI, it turns out, is a little bit racist and is not very good at explaining the reasons why it came to those conclusions. But guess what? The same is true of your physician. And the real question is, which of the two are better in terms of various kinds of settings and various kinds of combinations, right? So there's a way in which AI, on the flip side, might unburden some physicians from the kinds of implicit and explicit biases that they bring, might expose them to a much broader swath of information and case than even a physician who experiences and practices for 40 years will ever see, and may also enable a certain amount of clarity and a certain amount of ability to measure and to reproduce results in a way that human, unaided kind of interactions don't always. But the key thing, I think, is just to study and to be very attentive to the relationship between how the AI is implemented and how the physician kind of reacts to it. Because you've got artificial intelligences, machine learning agents that work great when you show them images, and they're really good at distinguishing cancer from non-cancer, malignant, benign. But it turns out when you actually put them into practice, because of the way physicians undercorrect, overcorrect, changes in staffing, how quickly, what stage of the development of a tumor you see a patient, what the socioeconomic status of the patients are, and how they're able to act on the information, the results you get are very different. So if there's one thing I can impart to people, it's this idea that like it's important that the AI looks good on paper and shows really good results when you test it kind of in the lab, but that's no kind of substitute or not an adequate substitute for really having assurance that it can do a good job in person in the real setting in which it's being deployed, which might be quite different from the setting in which it was trained.
Thank you very much. Now, as AI continues to be deployed in more and more settings, it seems inevitable that our clinician listeners may experience some point in the future in which either A, they find themselves disagreeing with a clinical AI, or B, they choose to leverage AI and there's some sort of negative patient outcome. From a legal perspective, how do we determine whom to hold accountable when medical errors occur and an AI is involved? And are there any situations in which our clinician listeners should be concerned that the choice to use AI or the choice to not use an available AI may place them at some sort of legal liability risk?
Great question. Okay. So let me again start by just showing you the big picture, and then I'm going to zone into the physician, which is to say, there's at least three people you might think are involved in a typical hospital-based AI. There is the developer, right, who essentially has built the product. It could be the hospital system itself, but often it's an outside developer. There is the hospital system, which has purchased it or implemented it. And then there's the physician who is asked to use it as well as their care team, right? And so you might have a theory of liability against all three of these. Turns out it's fairly hard to sue the developer. We have some work where we've suggested more hospital liability would be better because hospitals are better choosers than the average physician. But you know, the primary concern for physicians are, will I get sued and what's going to happen to me? So first, some good news, which is to say, my great colleague Michelle Mello at Stanford and her colleague Neil Guha have a good paper in the New England Journal of Medicine where they look at all the reported decisions from the last several years on AI in medicine and legal liability malpractice. And there are very few of them, right? Overall, if you were thinking about like what is risky as a physician, and again, the implementation is somewhat shallow now. There's a reason to think we'll have more implementation, therefore more lawsuits. But overall, you don't walk away thinking, oh gosh, this is one of the riskiest things I could do would be to incorporate in medical AI. And that might be bad actually, because it turns out actually bringing these lawsuits is quite hard. You have to really untangle what was the AI, how was it trained, did it cause the injury, would the physician have done the same thing anyways, right? So there might be a ways in which we have too little liability, not too much. But within the category where someone does bring a malpractice lawsuit, right? So as you say, there are instances. So I often use an example. We have an old paper. I have a paper with Sarah Garca, Nicholson Price in JAMA where we kind of walk through this step by step. And we take a very simple example, which is to imagine that you have a standard dose of chemotherapy agent for a patient would be 15 milligrams per kilogram every 3 weeks for an ovarian cancer patient. And for some reason, the AI recommends a higher dosage, right? So you have what the standard of care would have been, then you have the AI recommended dosage, which is higher. Now, the AI could either have made a great recommendation or a bad recommendation. And as you say, the physician could either have followed or disregarded the recommendation. And you're going to get into a case of injury when they follow a bad recommendation or they disregard a good recommendation, right? Those are instances where there's an injury. Does the law treat both kinds of cases of an injury equivalently? And the short answer is no, it doesn't. Because in medical malpractice, as long as you follow the standard of care, you are satisfying the obligations of your duty and you are not negligent. And therefore, we should say if you end up going to a jury and all the facts are proven, you should not be held liable for the action. Now, that's a good rule of thumb. Follow the standard of care. But if you think about it for a minute, actually it's terrible for all the value we want AI to add. And the reason is AI is valuable precisely in the cases where it tells us to do something for this patient that we would not ordinarily have done. And if all we're relying upon it to do is to confirm what we're going to do anyways, we're paying for the AI and we're getting very little value out of it. Maybe with Fulgo, we have more certainty, but we're not really getting value because we're missing the cases where actually the recommendations are helpful. So I think with my co-authors, one of the things we point out is we really want to have more adoption of AI. The idea of the standard of care always immunizes you. And even if the AI recommends something better than the standard of care, you ignore it, that's fine. You're not going to get sued. That might give physicians the wrong incentive. Over the long term, as with many other medical technologies, I bet you there's a ton of things those of you who are listening to this do now with technology that if I said, okay, well, actually, all the power on the earth has been drained and no machine ever works again. So please go back and do it the way they would have done it in 1940, or no computer ever works again. Please determine the answer to this. You'd be like, I don't know how to do that, right? There are things we just do. And if a physician said, yeah, I know that we have this MRI technology, but I don't understand how that works, so I don't think that works very well. I'll just go back to the way they did this in 1935 or whatever. That would be malpractice because we've moved to a place where the standard of care now takes into account the benefits of those technologies and using the technology as a standard of care. We may get to a place where that is true about medical artificial intelligence. And indeed, perhaps we should get there as to particular specialties and particular technologies, where in fact, it would be malpractice not to have a read by the AI, for example, and not to look at things, not to consider the AI recommendation. But the law of medical malpractice is relatively conservative and slow to move. So as long as a distinct minority of physicians still do it the old way, it's hard to have a conclusion that it violates the standard of practice not to use the AI. But the things that move the needle are the work of physicians, adoption, statements by physicians groups and kinds of, National Academies reports. These are the kinds of things that change our minds on this. But if anything, so again, just to put it into a soundbite, if the main reason you don't want to adopt AI now is liability, I have good news for you. The existing kind of suggestions of liability suggest there's not that many lawsuits about it, and most people are pretty well protected. And if anything, perhaps we have too much of a push to not using AI when it's beneficial, as opposed to too much of a push to adopt it when it's not beneficial.
Thank you. Many of our listeners may also be involved at various points in their careers in identifying and developing new use cases for clinical artificial intelligence. And so I'd love to invite you to speak briefly to some of the regulatory considerations that they may need to have in mind while doing so. In particular, when does a clinical AI tool typically cross the line into becoming a medical device that requires approval and regulation by an entity such as the FDA?
I give a very high level overview because the short answer is it's quite complicated and it's also changing over time, which is interesting. But maybe I'll start by saying this. The biggest mistake most people think is that FDA regulates most medical artificial intelligence. In fact, the vast majority of medical artificial intelligence will never be reviewed, certainly not reviewed with any scrutiny by FDA. FDA itself distinguishes between software in a medical device and software as a medical device. Software in a medical device is software that's integral to a medical device. That gets kind of, review to the extent it does with the medical device itself. Whereas SAMD, software as a medical device, is standalone software that is on its own a medical device. And to fall in that category, really the definition FDA has given it is the purposes that are intended to treat, diagnose, cure, mitigate, or prevent disease or other conditions, right? So an interesting example of this was actually the Apple Watch irregular rhythm notification feature for the heart, right? And it's considered to be SAMD, software as a medical device, because it's standalone software intended for a medical purpose. So that's like a first level distinction. Second thing to know is that Congress itself clawed back some of FDA's authority in what was called the 21st Century Cures Act. And basically it said, here are 5 categories of software functions that you might think were medical devices, but we're going to tell FDA, please don't treat them as medical devices. So they say things for administrative support of a healthcare facility, not a medical device. For maintaining or encouraging a healthy lifestyle, not a medical device. To serve as an electronic patient records, not as a medical device. For transferring, storing, converting formats, or displaying clinical laboratory tests or other device data results, not a medical device. And then this category is turned out to be the problem ones, certain ones to support certain clinical decisions, not a medical device. And here FDA has tried to kind of embellish this idea of when CDS, clinical decision support, does or does not become a medical device. And then it has like a multi-part kind of analysis about when this is the case. So these are where I would start kind of my analysis would be to say to work through these exceptions myself. But truthfully, if you're developing anything that's kind of really innovative, that's going to affect patient diagnosis, patient cure, mitigating disease, you're probably in the bailiwick where you should probably talk to somebody who can look at it with some depth of analysis in the general counsel's office or the like, especially if you are promoting the technology as opposed to just kind of developing it for kind of use in the hospital system, but not, the kind of usual practice of medicine. FDA itself typically takes the view that it doesn't regulate the practice of medicine. It regulates drugs and devices and some other items. And that's also an important distinction in thinking about this. But the short answer is it gets very complicated very quickly. There's a lot of gray areas, but the closer you are to diagnosis or cure or altering the structure or function of the human body, the more likely it is it's the kind of thing that you're going to worry about FDA kind of having control over. The more it is something else like, a decision tree or something like that, the less likely it's the kind of thing that FDA is going to assert authority over.
AI systems have the potential to improve clinical care and also have potential to exacerbate existing health disparities. What steps can we collectively take to ensure clinical AI systems are ethically developed and fairly distributed? What actions are available to us as clinicians if we identify specific harms caused by an AI tool at one of our institutions?
So I'm a big believer in ethics of design, that you don't design the thing and then worry about the ethics questions. You instead try to build ethical analysis into each stage, even from the very beginning. And when I say from the very beginning, I mean even the question of problem identification. And one thing I'll tell you is a lot of medical AI is about extending expertise. So taking expertise we already have, the best doctors, the best dermatologists, the best radiologists, and making them even better. But a lot of the ethical obligation or the benefit, I think, to the world is actually democratizing, not extending expertise or improving expertise, democratizing it in the sense of taking the kind of healthcare you get at some of our very good institutions and just making them available to a much larger swath of people, not only in the United States, but across the world. So just in the beginning, I often ask myself, or I tell people to ask themselves, why am I have a lot of things I can be doing with my time, even my time developing AI. Why have I identified? What's the gap have I identified? And is it the kind of gap that itself does some ethical good or produces equity? Or is it the kind of gap that does something else that's less interesting to me as an ethical person? Okay, so that's one piece of it. Second piece of it, I would say, is broadly speaking, those who've contributed data to help build your artificial intelligence should be beneficiaries of the artificial intelligence. And there should be, broadly speaking, an ethical ideal, a match between it. It would be terrible if we built AI over the backs of patients across the entire United States, rich, poor, rural, urban. But it turns out the AI is priced and developed and deployed in a way that only at MGH here in Boston, man's greatest hospitals, we sometimes jokingly call it, can people use it, and huge swaths of the population cannot. So is there a good match between the population deployment population that are building? Third point, this relates to this question about bias. As I said before, bias is a reality in the practice of medicine by physicians about AI. It's also a reality in the practice of medicine with AI. And the real question is, are we improving or are we doing worse on those biases? And are the same groups, if we're going to be biased some of the time, no matter what, is it the same groups that always told, oh, I'm so sorry, right? I'm so sorry, Black patients, or I'm so sorry, patients with disabilities. It's always you who the AI doesn't work for. It's always you who has the quote unquote non-standard body, right? So some obligation of thinking about compound justice. But I do think just internally, the first step you say, when I notice a problem in terms of deployment, in terms of results that suggests to me that there is a bias in the system, there's a group that's adversely affected, where do I go? The first step is always in the institution, because the institution itself should be really worried about this and they should take their legal and ethical obligations very seriously. Beyond that, there may be opportunities to notify if it's an FDA approved device, notify FDA. If it's a question about racial discrimination, for example, there may be agencies within the Health and Human Services Department. There may be state agencies that are interested. It's insurers. There might be insurance regulation. But I always tell people, I think for the most part, people, I assume good intentions in the people who kind of develop AI. I work with a lot of them. And I know that for the most part, they're doing this, maybe they hope to make some money, but they're really doing this because they hope to make a difference. If you tell that person, I know you're making a difference, but it turns out it's having this terrible impact for this group, my sense is that at a first level, they or the hospital systems that work with them will want to try to do something to fix that, or should at least be given the opportunity. So I would say start with the internal processes and then only then consider the external processes.
Thank you so much, Professor Cohen, for all your time today. As we prepare to close, are there any final thoughts or parting advice you'd like to share with our clinician audience?
I'll say two more things if that's okay. One
Love it.
is just to think about as a worker, how you as a worker are affected by this. When we talk about AI's impact on the workforce, we're often thinking about the history of ATM machines and bank tellers, or we're thinking people on the factory floor. But actually, your life as a physician could be radically different in a world where AI is very pervasively involved in care versus one where you retain the choices to make the final decisions for patients versus ones where actually a lot of that is shielded, and practicing medicine is more like being Iron Man in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. That's just things popping up and heads up displays and stuff like that. So I just encourage you to think about yourself as an actor who has voice and is empowered to kind of help push things. The second thing I'll just say is just to pay attention to sort of who is involved and how concentrated the industries are. And we're seeing this a little bit with large language models that I'm really, medical AI thus far has been truly a kind of very varied sort of set of actors. There's hospital systems, there's software companies, there's sole entrepreneurs. There's lots of people involved in the ecosystem. With large language models, we're seeing a lot more of a concentration in the hands of a few. And maybe that's a good thing in some instances. In some industries, there's a natural scale to them. But I think that whatever problems and concerns we have, whether it's racial bias, whether it's control, whether it's transparency, to the extent we have a few foundational models that get propagated and then a couple of large corporations hold the keys to and pull the strings, the likelihood those things that bother us about those models are going to get propagated throughout the system. So to me, that's worth thinking about as well, and thinking about also how your role is as influencers and stakeholders in hospital systems, as purchasers and the like, that you have a say in that as well. So I'll stop there, but thank you very much for having me.
Thank you so much. And for our listeners, this special Q&A session with Professor Aiglan Cohen has been part of our open source AI Citizenship for Clinicians course series. Please see below for links for more lecture videos, slides, and hands-on tutorial sessions. Thanks so much for your time.